Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 365. I'm your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're honored to have with us the nationally recognized writer and Vermont author of Dear Aunt Bea, Rebecca Cummins.
The sun will come out pretty soon. It's gorgeous here.
That's right. And as of this recording, Rebecca, this is technically the longest day of the year that we're experiencing right now. I'm really excited to talk to you about this book. So this book came out through Onion River Press, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about this, your inspiration behind writing Dear Aunt Bea. It's a journal of a journey. Is that also the subtitle of that?
Yeah. Yes, it is. From a 10-year-old's perspective, right? My major inspiration was children of around 10, having observed them in many different settings, but especially as my grandchildren became that age and watching the things that they were contemplating and just, getting back into my own 10-year-old brain and seeing how they were managing life was pretty exciting. Some of them were friends who had kids that age, my neighbors' grandkids. So, there's quite a variety. Our local community kids that age. So they inspired me to wonder how they're viewing some of the difficult social and environmental changes in their life. They are our future, and I want them to feel secure and find solutions and not be afraid or stressed. And kids that age seem to be trying to find their place in the world, as well as navigating the social and the cultural and the environmental difficulties. So they inspired me. And then, of course, my Aunt Bea, my own Aunt Bea, her name was Vivian, but I, from a child on, called her Aunt Bea probably had something to do with my speech pattern. Instead of B, it came out as B. So she was always my Aunt Bea. But she and her husband and my parents and all the cousins used to camp together a lot. And we walked all through the Indiana woods. And so I had her in my mind as if you needed to communicate with a safe person. She was my safe person, even though we didn't talk about it that way or trust it at all. But she would be my go-to person to talk to when I maybe was frustrated with my own family or just didn't feel like I was being heard. She was there to hear. So she would have been the natural way for this character, Jimi, to have someone to be a sounding board as they are navigating a new environment. So those were basically the major inspiration for it. I like to say it's a story that found me, not what I ever thought I would like to write, but I really enjoyed writing it.
Because you wrote it with the character Jimi, which was the main character, kind of, embarks on a journey of, discovering this new environment. How much of this, as you mentioned before, is an inspiration to your own childhood? So in a way, could it also reflect as a almost a memoir in some aspects too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting you say that, because I think at least one of my own children said, "Well, Mom, sounds a little like you." So I think that when you're writing, you do draw, especially if you're trying to get into a child's point of view, you have to get there by recalling your own. The last line of Nostress that Louise Gluck wrote was, "We look at the world once in childhood, the rest is memory. And that I didn't see
Hmm.
that until after I wrote the book, but I thought that really resonates for what you have to do to, if you want to write from that perspective, is to just go back there. And then
Right.
a lot of that is what Jimi, what I would have been doing as a child, but if I could have lived here when I was that age,
Right.
then this new environment is the exploration.
You also mentioned too is that it does address some complex and some challenging topics of moving and going into a new environment. How did you kind of balance some of those heavier themes of childhood while also balancing that sense of wonder and adventure that childhood has as well?
Yeah, I would say that I outlined a bit of a structure when I first started writing. The first chapter I would say was just I mean the first entry was just, it came to me and I explored it and wrote it, and then I maybe wrote a couple more entries, and then I wanted to put it into some kind of structure, and so I structured it by each entry needed to have some kind of action, some kind of observation, and some kind of reflection. And so I would go back and check to make sure that those elements were in were were there. So that was like the regular framework. So as I would write each chapter, I had that in my head. What's Jimi going to do today, and
Hmm.
observe, and so it was good to have something like that. Um, but the theme of what you do with, it's kind of a scientific process to do that, to have some kind of action and reflection, and what ideally that leads to wonder, and more wonder comes from the first step into that world. Observation is strengthened by practice, and the reflection, hopefully, especially with research
Hmm.
of facts, can really lead to a child or a person having some kind of a reasonable hypothesis about what's happening. And then
Right.
hopefully that leads to empathy for others and solutions. So that's kind of what the internal working framework was for me, to keep it somewhat consistent. So then anything that came up in a day is something to explore. And the artwork came into that part of Jimmy's experience of exploration. And then it just, kind of expanded from there. What would Jimmy be thinking today about, a little bit of a walk in the
Right.
woods? What would that inspire? So it's not a big
And so
stray
does this
woods.
right. And now, does this book is this a more or less a timeless book? So does it take place in say the year 2024, or does it seem like it takes place in any time?
Thank you for asking that question, because I think when I first ran, I had a lot of editors, feedback from people, and my sister was early and a major part, and she's the one who suggested, why are you putting a year on it? Because I was telling her I'm trying to get it in a framework that's
Right.
relatable. And she said, just don't put a year on it. And so that freed me up so much. Then I'm just looking at seasons, and I'm not looking at days of the week. I'm looking at, put a number to it, but it's what is happening here in this season, and what would be natural to explore. And then later, I went back
Right.
and made those dates birthdays of family members, as many who were have birthdays between September and March. So some of my family got left out of that because they didn't go through a whole year, but it was fun to just
Right.
add to that. But to me, it's timeless. I want it to be timeless, because if I could feel some of those things in the 1950s, and kids must be feeling them now. I don't have. I think that those are just there are things happening in the world in different eras that children may be concerned about, but it's I think it should translate to whatever you're worried about. What can you do to
Right.
solve that, or where do you find resources to help you get through it? So thanks for asking that because it was important to me. It was a big thing when I didn't have to put a date on it or a year.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, but what about like for instance like kids these days because it takes place you said there's it's very nature themed as well. Um is there any discussion of climate change that happens in your book at all?
Yes, I allude to it in several areas.
Mm,
Jimmy wonders about her father's impact on the environment, and then their neighbor at the top of the hill begins construction on new things, big things, big projects that are going to impact what happens to the streams. So there is that kind of several times of alluding to a concern for climate change. But be-
mm,
because of that, because Jimmy studies and learns, then they begin to develop ideas for making an effort to help in those solutions, find solutions or contribute in good ways to minimizing the climate change. So it's it's slow growing. It's not a real punch. It's not uh, a thing that you would necessarily notice unless you're just reading through, because it's like
mm.
dipping your toes in it, which a child would do. A child's not going to necessarily jump in with, you know, big questions like that. But
Right.
definitely it's meant to address a concern about climate.
Right. Now, so how do you see with is so that this is who would you say is the main character in it? Is it Jimmy? Is it Aunt Bea? Is or is it the the landscape or the environment around Jimmy that
Hmm.
is center to the story?
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, perhaps perhaps it's actually the environment. We're seeing it through Jimmy's eyes and hearing it communicated through the writing. Um, another generation had opened Jimmy's eyes to the world, but that's very interesting because I think my own focus in writing was just to be through Jimmy, but was really about what I love here, what
Mm,
I love about Vermont.
right.
Yeah, and exploring things.
And
So,
you
but yeah,
so
that's,
yeah. We mentioned before like also is like your background is in teaching and in education and how is how has your background in education affected you as a writer?
uh, so I, I taught eighth grade literature for many years, and I would read 10 stories, 10 short stories to find one that I could share in the class. And so because I had a lot of boys, you know, in that era when I was teaching to keep the attention of the whole class, you had to capture the interest of the little bit rowdy boys. So I would
Mm,
screen through what are these kids going to want to read together and how can I make that interesting. So I think that that period of time was really exciting because I read so much with that thought in mind. What does a kid want to hear? Um, and then as a principal, I didn't have time to read, but I certainly observed a lot of student behavior and concerns and why they acted up. I had the discipline, of course, so Um,
Mm.
Very interesting what kids bring to that to inform you about what's happening and why they react the way they do. So, those are probably good things to keep in the back of my mind.
Well, hey there. If you're enjoying our podcast, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep this show going. We love hearing from you, so any feedback is welcome. And thank you for being a part of our podcast family and for all your support. It truly means a lot to us. I'm just kind of curious to talk to you also about your role as a writer when it comes to building this. You mentioned before it took you about 2 years to get the book together.
Yeah, yeah, from the beginning of when I started writing, and then we went through a lot of process with sharing it with my husband, getting his input, and I had like shared it with grandkids, but I had one who's at that age that was really important to hear their impressions of what got actually excellent feedback from that child, and then my neighbor. She was a teacher and a principal, and we walk every day. And I shared it with her, and she came up with so many helpful strategies. And then by the time I had it completely roughed out, actually, I would have said I thought I was done with it. That's when I started looking for a publisher, and I wanted it to be Vermont. So Onion River, I read about it and got in touch with Rachel Fisher, the managing editor. And after we met, it still took about probably a year
Hmm.
to finish that process with a, a professional copy editor who also acted as a content editor for me. That was Riley Earl. And then I was introduced to a book designer, and then Jenny Lyons and I worked quite a bit after that because it was a complicated book to set up with, from doing your
Right.
books, all color illustrations, what you've done. Um,
Yeah.
the complicating factor probably for this one was that I had included so many contributing artists, and so the style was different for each of those. And Jenny and I, were able to really find the places that worked together for us. I like
Right.
what she did with the cover.
Yeah, it looks it. Yeah, for those that check it out. You can go to onionriverpress.com and see the book. Also, it's available at wherever books are sold. The title is Dear Aunt Bea. Yeah, and that's for our listeners is BEA. And it's really cool. So it's 80 pages. So it's a good read for the age range is 9 to 12. I was also curious to ask you, Rebecca, is what was the feedback you got that from the youth that were your beta readers? Was there any advice that they gave you on it that you had to tweak the book a bit?
Yes. So one comment my grandchild made was, uh, "Nana, why you probably could break that long sentence down a little bit. It's like a lot too much information at once, or use smaller words." So based on that, that was very helpful. I was had kept an eye to that, and then I started the definitions and put them in Jimmy's own words, and put a
Oh,
little
cool.
feather by the definitions for each one each time I did it. So I thought, well, that's a good way. Anytime I see a word that is in my head to use, and I thought probably was from my childhood, but who knows what your language really was way back. But I still thought it was a good word, but I would put it into kid language a little bit more uh, thoughtfully to make sure kids were following or not intimidated by it. So that was
Right.
a good stores. Then otherwise,
Yeah.
that I think that there um, there are what shall I say? They're quiet in responding more so than adults might be. You know, they're not forthcoming as much with what it means to them, or don't have a conversation about it in general. So I think that's probably natural. And I will say I'm going to have a very exciting experience this fall in September. Um, I had shared the book with a principal, and then she had shared it with a couple of teachers. And I had another friend who suggested that maybe it would be a good book to read as a cross curricular activity. So that's in the works for September at our own Montgomery Elementary School. And I'm very excited about that because then I think in a slow and more focused way of reading it together as several people reading the same book, I think that will bear fruit in ways that I can't know. I mean, I hope that it means something. I hope it plants a seed of hope and empathy. So it's just hasn't been out very long, and I haven't had a reading where children have been present. So I don't know exactly how it will.
You got the writer's bug. Are you gonna? When's the next book coming out then, Rebecca?
I think my hope for this one, if it's in a school setting and kids are, I mean, they're going to be learning. I mean, they already are very facile at internet research, but they're going to be connecting with various content curriculum. And my hope is that
Hmm.
from an English class or a language class, that their project will be to write their own journal to a trusted adult. So that's who I would like to see write the next one. Some
Right.
Somebody who's still a child. I never had thought that I would write one. That's why I say I never thought I'd write a children's book. But as they say, there were a couple inspirations beyond that. There was a book I read as a child where this character Redcap that comes into the first chapter um, is is reflective of the book I read as a child, of a child walking all alone in the woods, um, kind of friendless and just exploring and having some kind of conversation with this stranger with a red cap and a black cloak. And those early 50s, so you're not thinking scary things in the woods at this point. But because I was never afraid of that story. But in the end, it becomes who Redcap becomes in my book. So I looked for that book online every way I could possibly Google what that book was and couldn't find it, or I would have credited the author with some inspiration there. But anyway, I think children writing journals and who knows what book stays with you. Who would ever think that that book I read would still come back to me off and on.
So, Rebecca, if people want to learn more about you and the book, where's the best place they could go to?
Oh, it's in the independent bookstores, a lot of Vermont
Okay.
independent bookstores. And I mean, you can look up the list of them. I have it in most Phoenix bookstores, of course. But
Right.
there's one in St. Albans, the Eloquent Page. There's one, Bear Pond Bookstore in Montpelier. I've got one in Barrie at the Next Chapter Bookstore. Everyone's books in Brattleboro. It's exciting for
Okay,
me.
cool.
Yeah. Bellows Falls, the Village Square Booksellers. Um, and then I think a couple others I don't have written down. But then it's also available, like in some of our local craft stores. There's Crafty Little Shop in Montgomery, Barn Owl Bistro in East Berkshire, J Country Store in Jay, up the mountain, Boston Post Dairy in Enosburg, and Moss in Morrisville. I just went there uh, within the last month or so and met them. They've moved across the street into that nice new building.
Right.
So that we talked about journal writing, and I think that she placed it close to where she sells journals, the blank journals, so that maybe kids will pick up a journal and start their own. Share it publicly because I'm shy. Um, and so it's really hard to get out there. I've given away probably 100 books because I don't want to ask anybody to spend money on them, Some people have bought them anyway, but
You can purchase it also, as you mentioned, at Phoenix Books. You can go to onionriverpress.com and order the book directly. It's always good to support, as you mentioned, support local bookstores, local independent bookstores. It's
yeah.
always a great point. Well, this has been great, Rebecca. Any final comments?
Just want to say
Perfect.
how much I've enjoyed listening to your interviews with other people. And I read the comment about you being the Mr. Rogers of the artist author podcast interviews. That's right on. You are the Mr. Rogers. I like that. And I'm watching your videos of road songs.
Oh,
Oh
you
my
watching
goodness.
those? Yeah.
Yes, 5 years ago. They really wear well. It's really,
Thank you.
it's really
Thank you.
good. Yeah.
And what all of her family told her before she moved to the United States is like, if he invites you into the woods, you say no. And I'm like, that's so weird. And it was because basically any movie that leaves, our shores and goes overseas, there's not one happy movie about the North American woods. It's
Yeah,
always like
that's true.
a bear or a ghost or a
Yeah.
witch or something, or there's always something bad about the woods in North America. There's never anything
Yeah.
happy about the woods. So my wife was
It's
just like, to
dark
this
and
day she never wants to
scary.
go camping. Yeah. I
Oh,
mean, man, but I love,
yeah.
yeah, so I'm again, being from Vermont. I'm an eighth generation Vermonter. I grew up in the woods. I love it.
Mm,
But yeah,
yeah.
she doesn't want to go anywhere near the woods. Yeah.
Oh, I'll have to get
All
her up
right.
here for a good
Let
hike.
me. I know exactly. All right. Let me get. So this should be about 20 minutes or so, Rebecca, and then we'll. This is the last. So I got some few